Sputnik 2. I am receiving you. Thanks for the dog food.
The Cold War was being fought on multiple fronts, from actual fighting and battles, mutually shared destruction threats, and attempted regime changes, to the space race and other scientific discoveries. Now, both sides had their victories in space, with the obvious one being America's landing on the moon with Apollo 11 and the Soviet Union's first person in space, Yuri Gagarin, aboard the Vostok 1. But the real precursor to both of those was Sputnik 2, carrying a stray, mixed-breed dog named Laika. Sputnik 2 was assembled very quickly, in roughly 3 weeks' time, which included both the planning, designing, assembly, and launch, so the craft could be launched on the 40th anniversary of the October Revolution, the event which marked the beginning of Soviet Russia. And this deadline was imposed by Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, personally. But with such a short deadline, Sergei Korolev had to largely improvise. As the head rocket engineer, he ordered a payload used in the R-5A missile and attached it to the R-7 launching rocket underneath the Sputnik 2 satellite. Without the rocket, the PS-2 weighed roughly 500 kilograms, but since the core was not designed to detach from the rocket core, the total weight was roughly 17 metric tons. Within the craft, there were many pieces of scientific equipment for measuring, recording, and observing, including a substantial piece of tech for measuring solar radiation, including 2 spectrometers, which would send its information to the scientists for 15 minutes each orbit. The compartment was the most forward piece within the capsule. Below it, there was a sphere which contained the radio transmitters and the equipment needed for them to function. At the bottom, there was a sealed and padded cabin where Laika was positioned. It was cramped, but reportedly big enough for the test dog to stand, sit, and lie down. There was no room for her to turn around because it would interfere with the waste bag attached to her rear. There were probes surgically implanted before the flight, which measured her respiration, blood pressure, and her pulse. Within the compartment, there was a television camera that broadcasted back to base to observe her movements and temperament. On the front of the cabin, there was a small window 6 inches wide. Laika was not going to come back, as the time constraints imposed by Khrushchev had not allowed the engineers or scientists to come up with a recovery plan. Laika was a Soviet space dog, a part of a now infamous program by Soviet scientists that aimed to test the reaction of mammals in suborbital and orbital flight, which, despite the obvious issues, was an important part of the Soviet space travel. The United States sent multiple chimps and apes to space, and the French space program sent a cat and 2 monkeys. It was not a Soviet-specific issue, but the Soviet version is the most infamous due to Laika's demise. The dogs used by the space program were usually strays taken from the Moscow streets, and mixed breeds were preferred. Both of these factors supposedly made the dogs resilient to weather and temperature changes and to be less affected by dehydration and starvation. Once they were captured, they were subjected to training, including being confined to increasingly small boxes for up to 20 days at a time, and being placed in centrifuges to mimic the take-off experience while wearing specially designed spacesuits. The launch preparations began on the 18th of October, 1957, when both the launch vehicle and the satellite arrived at the precursor to the Baikonur Cosmodrome, called the NIIP-5 test range, disassembled. Here, the missile was put together, the payload integrated, and the satellite prepared. 10 days before the launch, Laika was chosen as its passenger by Yazdovsky. The day before the launch, October 30th, Yazdovsky took Laika to his home to play with his children. At midday, October 31st, Laika was placed in the cabin, wearing a special spacesuit and harness, and the door was closed. Laika was continuing to be observed until the 3rd of November, when at 2:30 a.m., the rocket lifted off from LC-1. Once the rocket reached orbit, the nose cone detached properly, but the rocket itself did not detach. This caused extreme temperatures in the cabin. At peak acceleration, Laika's breathing was 3 to 4 times the amount she was experiencing before launch, or roughly 80 to 90 breaths per minute. Her heartbeat pre-launch was 103 BPM before rising to 240 BPM. After 3 hours in space, her heart rate rested at 102 BPM, which was 5 times longer than expected from pre-flight testing. Laika was restless but eating, though after 5 signs, her life signs were fading, and by the 7th hour, no more life signs were recorded. Since they had a camera, the scientists were most likely watching Laika take her final breaths as she passed away. Sputnik completed 2,370 orbits over 174 days. Sputnik 2 was a success for the Soviet Union, as it proved that mammals could survive in space. 3 years later, Sputnik 5 would carry Bielka and Strelka in orbit for a day before safely returning to Earth. After Sputnik 2 disintegrated over the Atlantic Ocean, the Soviet Union claimed that on the 5th day of the flight, Laika had been peacefully euthanized via poisoned food. Though, in 2002, Dmitry Malashnikov revealed that Laika had died after the 4th orbit of Earth due to overheating. During the launch, some thermal insulation had been lost, and along with the rocket not detaching properly, caused extreme temperatures in the cabin, ultimately killing Laika. Laika has been memorialized with numerous Soviet stamps, statues, plaques, books, songs, shows, and dramatizations, and recently has seen a large increase in part due to social media, especially TikTok, where discussion of her story has been reignited, though with large amounts of misinformation, unfortunately.
Moscow to Sputnik 2. I think we're losing you. Your life signs are fading. We can't really say that we